Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of LinkedIn Office Hours. I'm your host, Robbie Baxter. Thank you so much for tuning in. Before we dive into the content for today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge what's happening to our friends in Southern California, down south. Um, it's horrific, and our hearts are with you. And we recognize that we're, having the privilege of having this kind of a conversation when so many of our colleagues and friends are fighting for their homes and their lives. So our hearts go out to you. We're thinking of you, and yeah, it's a very, very hard time. With that, I want to change gears. Today, we're talking about the key drivers of loyalty and strategies for improving retention, both with customers and with employees. My guest today is my longtime friend, Elizabeth Lotardo, the author of Leading Yourself, which I actually have right here. If you don't have it, get yourself a copy. We'll put a link in the chat. Today, we're going to be exploring the overlap and distinctions in creating loyalty, leaving you hopefully with some actionable takeaways to win both customers and teammates. With that, let's get started. Let me bring Elizabeth out here. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thanks for having me, Robbie. I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, me too. Let's just dive in. Tell me about your work. You recently wrote this book, Leading Yourself, but it's been a long time coming.
It has been a long time coming. So you and I are both consultants. We go in and out of tons of organizations. And I'm sure you witness the same phenomenon that I do. That inside one organization, sometimes inside one team, some people are thriving and others are not. Some people are performing really well, others are struggling. Some people are really engaged, they're finding meaning and purpose and fulfillment. Others hate the experience. So what I've always sought to articulate is, why is that? What makes someone thrive and someone else not, even in the same conditions? And I first coined the term leading yourself in a 2017 LinkedIn course, and I've been deepening my studies ever since, eventually resulting in this new book on what does it take to create a fulfilling, meaningful, joyful work experience, to have more opportunities, and how can you do that from whatever seat you're in?
Yeah. So you have the book. You also have a bunch of really popular courses on LinkedIn Learning. Some with Lisa McLeod, and some on your own. Can you just give us a little bit of a background of how those fit in with your work?
Absolutely. So the red thread through all of my LinkedIn courses, like Leading Yourself, Leading Without Formal Authority, Finding Purpose at Work, is how can an individual contributor create a more successful work experience for themselves? How can you, even if your boss isn't great, even if the economy is kind of, even if your organization doesn't have some breakthrough product, how can you make it successful for you? So that's the red thread. And I approach that topic on LinkedIn Learning through a couple of different angles.
And why did you get interested in this topic in the first place? What was going on in your life that made leading yourself something that you had to think about? I know you've been a consultant for quite some time. Was it your consulting work, or was it prior to that, or was it your colleagues?
It's a little bit of everything. You know, in hindsight, you can see the early stages of the idea, like I'm sure you see with membership economy and forever transaction, like that early phase where you didn't have the language to put it forth. But what really started me on this journey was my own work experience. After college, got a job that I was thrilled to get and quickly found myself not that happy. And I watched that experience play out with tons of my friends, but not all of my friends. And that was the first time I really looked at what are the factors that create a fulfilling work experience. And what I found in the first examination, and has only been solidified since, is it's not picking the perfect job. It's not working for the perfect leader. It's not having some unicorn organization. It is creating for yourself and leading yourself to a better work experience. So I think the early stages of my work were like abstract versions of where I am now, much like a lot of people who take a concept all the way through their career. But I think, it's a lived experience and so many people relate to it, whether you're happy in one place or unhappy in another, whether you see friends who are having that experience. It really impacts your life, and to have a career that is helping people find more joy and fulfillment at work is a really cool thing to have.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I have so many thoughts on this, and I wish your book was around when I was 22 and starting out my career. When I had several different jobs, as many people do, and different managers, and my very first manager, Marianne Gilmartin, was fantastic, and really cared about my development and thought I was really good and worth investing in. But then I had some managers who were stretched really thin, who had other things in mind, who wanted me to do things that they in hindsight, they hadn't really hired me for, and I lacked the skills for it. So they were constantly disappointed that, how come you don't know how to code? Well, I didn't know how to code when I got here. It shouldn't be a surprise. But, there is this question of like, who's going to come and rescue me and take care of me, especially if you've been, like I think we both were a really good student and kind of on a very clear path. You kind of step off that path and you're like, where do I go next? And who's going to lead me? And I see this also with my, I have 3 kids, 2 of them are, out of college, and one is a senior sort of trying to figure out what he's going to do next year. And this question of, where do I go? What's the path? Where's the path? I've been telling them, this is where you lead yourself.
Absolutely. And the self leadership never stops. I think one thing I experienced, and I'd have to believe a lot of people experience, is that in school, and you and I both went to an undergrad and a graduate program, success is defined really clearly. You get the instructions on the first day of what it takes to be successful here. Your professor or your TA has office hours where you can get the support that you need. And the next step is defined. It's passing this course so you can get to the 201, so you can get to the 301. And the working world is completely different. You don't have that level of clarity of expectations. You don't have access to that level of individualized support. And the next step is often yours to decide. So it's a huge change, but it's also a huge opportunity to own your role.
Yeah, that's wise. I want to kind of break this down. So let's talk about people who are just coming out of college, right? How do they, or out of high school or out of a graduate program, their first time sort of not having a clear path, an obvious path. Is it just like you said, you lead yourself and it doesn't matter what the job is, it really matters how you handle it. But are there things that you should be thinking about as you choose that first role?
I certainly think there's a lot of factors to consider when you're choosing your first role, but it's also important to recognize no job is going to be perfect. And if it seems perfect in the interview, that's not going to last. So get really clear on what the most important factors are for you, whether that is a growth opportunity, whether that's working in a particular industry, whether that's working for someone you really admire, and really emphasize those, because you're not going to find the position that is all encompassing. Having said that, even if some things are absent, their absent doesn't have to be permanent. If there aren't clear expectations in your role, like there are in a college course, you can ask. You can have those conversations with your boss. You can get clear on what success looks like. You can define next steps. You can ask for support instead of hoping that there's this office hour opportunity like there is in school. And I think the reason we see so much turnover, particularly early in careers, is we make the mistake of believing, and I'm guilty of this mistake as well. That's why I say that we pick the wrong job. That all of these things are going wrong because we picked the wrong job. And if we got a new job, they'd all be going right. And that's so often not the case. And it takes a long time to realize that. Unfortunately, I think we cost ourselves and our employers a lot when we jump the gun too quickly in terms of moving on.
Yeah, it's wise because there's, I think about careers, and I think about, optionality, first of all, that you want to take jobs that keep your options open.
Yep.
And then you want to remember that a lot of the agency is in your hands from that moment, and what you do with the job, you often have more control than you think you do. About, as you said, about when to touch base with your manager, how to collaborate with others, how to get educated outside of the workplace. There's a lot more agency. I want to sort of switch gears though, and this is from the employee perspective, right? What you can do. You're leading yourself, right? Your book. All these papers here. The book really talks about that from that perspective. But the other side of it is, if you're a manager, right, what can you do? Right? A lot of this was written, I think, it sounds like, out of your own recognition of some of the frustrations of professionals trying to, have meaningful work, right?
Yeah.
Have meaningful work. And there is a lot of agency, but your manager and your employer do have a lot of leverage in what they can do to make that easier and more difficult. And I'd like to explore that with you, particularly around the question of retention. What can employers do, from who they hire, but all the way through an employee's tenure, to ensure that employee is productive and wants to stay?
There are so many factors that contribute to employee retention, just like all the factors that contribute to customer retention. But I think an umbrella message is this: hire people who feel empowered and then don't squash that feeling. When someone is applying for a job, they are at a peak in terms of wanting to drive change, in terms of being engaged in their role, in terms of personal enthusiasm. And what often happens is we fall off right after we get the job. A manager's role is to make sure that fall off doesn't happen. So how do you do that as a leader? It comes down to, the first subtitle of my book, Meaning, Joy, and Opportunities. How, for your employees, are you creating that spirit of meaning, knowing that the work makes a difference? How are you working in these elements of joyful connection, and how are you nurturing them and defining what opportunity could be from here? Ideally, managers are doing that. One would suggest that if everyone was, we wouldn't have the retention problems that we do. But I think from a leadership perspective, it's really tempting to squash that feeling of initial empowerment because you don't want someone to make mistakes. They are putting forth ideas without all the context you have, so you're quick to tamper them, and over time erode their spirit, most of the time unintentionally so. But when we focus as leaders on nurturing that level of empowerment, people most of the time enter their role with, that's when we really start to see that self-starter, that self-agency take hold for the long term.
Yeah, a really important point that I hope people are taking away from this is that moment of transaction, the first day at work, the day you accept your offer, that period, that's when you have to establish norms, right? That's when the person is most engaged and is really going to decide whether or not this is a good job, right?
Yes.
And so onboarding is really important. Right? What is their experience like? And you pointed out something that is so counterintuitive, which is you bring on this new person, and as a manager, all you're thinking is, I don't want them to fail, right? I don't want them to. So I'm going to watch them very closely, and I'm going to, be side by side. I'm going to micromanage them, or I'm going to kind of burden them with all of this, learn about the company and, do your train, not let them kind of dive in and do something that feels meaningful. Are there key elements of onboarding, or, in the world of customer onboarding, I always say there's three things you want to do. The first thing is you want to reinforce the wisdom of their decision, right? This was the right choice to buy this product or to subscribe to this service. The second thing that you want to do is get them to value immediately. I signed up for, the NBA League Pass because it's halftime and I actually want to watch the second half of the game. Get them to the game. Don't ask them 1,000 questions about how they like to watch basketball or who their favorite players are. And then the third thing is to paint a path for how your best customers get the most value. Help them establish the habits that are going to make them successful while they still care, while they're still fully engaged.
That's peak enthusiasm.
Peak enthusiasm. So I wonder if there are sort of similar principles that come to mind when you're thinking about how to onboard an employee as a manager.
I think all three of those principles are validated from an employee perspective because people are people, whether we're signing up to work for somewhere, whether we're signing up for a new cable subscription, our emotions often run parallel in those experiences. Certainly changing your entire career is different than signing up for a new cable subscription, but the emotional arc, I bet, is really similar. Because you have this moment of peak enthusiasm, whether it's the cable subscription or the employer. And if the employer doesn't validate that you made the right decision, if they don't get you into the work you signed up to do and are excited about quickly, and if they don't paint a path forward from here, they're going to experience the same retention struggles that a membership-based business will. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'm finding this like the same principles really are applying. I think that the challenge that comes up that I think is different is for most subscription businesses, when you onboard, it's being managed by the company. It's being managed by the customer experience team. It's consistent. Now, this is different if you're working one-on-one. So if let's say it's I don't know, some kind of professional services provider that works on subscription, they may, have to actually train their individual people and certainly customer success professionals, but there's a script even for that. There's a boxes to check. Now, when you're a manager, hiring a person, you're kind of left to your own devices in some ways. And so I'm wondering, I guess I have two questions. One of them is, can you give an example of a manager in a real company, you don't have to name the company, but a real manager and a real new employee, and how those early days set the tone? And then the other question I have is, it's a bigger question, and we can get to that next. But what does the company need to do versus what the manager needs to do in order to ensure that employee is fully engaged? What can be done? What is your advice to managers and leaders that are trying to think about how do we keep the best employees?
Well, ideally, a frontline manager is not on their own to do this. Just like you wouldn't send a customer success person to blindly onboard your customers with no direction and hope that they know exactly what to say because you hired them and they should just figure it out, right? Unfortunately, a lot of organizations are sending managers out to onboard employees exactly that way, with no resources, with no training. So we have this huge spectrum of success, and we have employees really confused because there's not this consistent experience. So I think the parallel of those journeys plays out in terms of the person doing the onboarding, whether it's a customer success representative for an outbound customer or whether it's manager to employee. That person needs support. So your questions are certainly connected. There's a really great example of onboarding in the book. I think it's called The Power of Moments by Chip and Dan Heath. They talk about the John Deere onboarding experience, which is amazing. And the excerpt is published online, so you can read it if you just Google their book title and John Deere. But what they talk about in that excerpt is how, as an organization of which the manager is playing a big role, they create an onboarding experience that offers the employee joy, meaning, and opportunities. It says, joy, you made the right decision. This is going to be a good experience. It's going to be meaningful. It's going to value you. And You can go forward from here without going to another organization. So how do they do that? It's tons of factors, everything from a CEO video that plays right when you sit down at your desk and says, I'm so glad you're here. You're joining this purpose-driven organization. I know you're going to make a difference for us. You're going to make a difference for our customers. I can't wait to see what you do in this role. How does that make them feel? It makes them feel awesome. They're validated in their decision. Their manager sets up lunch for them with tons of different colleagues to learn about the organization. So instead of dumping this binder of onboarding materials at them to study, they are having that knowledge gain naturally through conversations. And in that, they're also forging relationships. So in that moment, the manager is facilitating this. Here's where you go from here. You're in the meat of it. This is what you signed up for. And then the manager is also talking about, from the very first day, next steps for that role. Where can you go from here? And it's not you do this individual contributor role and then you become manager of people who do that individual contributor role. Like, it's not always linear. They're painting this. There are opportunities for you inside this organization. If you want to change departments, if you want to change locations, we can support you in that. And I think talking about next plays is often scary because you just hired this person and you don't want them to leave, right? You invested a lot in bringing them on, but employees are thinking about it. So the question is their manager in that mental conversation or not? It's happening whether you address it or whether you don't. People are always thinking about what's next for them, just like customers are always thinking about what's next for them. How long am I going to stay with this? Are there better options available? Constantly evaluating.
Yeah. So continuing down the path of, I think you answered both questions, by the way. So
they're connected. I think we're looking at the entirety of the onboarding experience, and just like how customer success representatives are not entirely responsible for customer retention and successful onboarding, neither are managers. It takes support from a lot of arms.
Right. I mean, I guess I see the similarities. I think that the difference is a customer success manager is specifically hired to do a specific role that is well defined after the first person gets that role, whereas a manager wears many hats. They might be managing people, but they might also have responsibility for a functional area like finance or product development or engineering, or sales. And their skills may not be in management, whereas a customer success manager, by definition, is brought in to do that one thing. And so I think that's sort of an interesting distinction. But I do think there's a lot of commonality, and I appreciate you bringing up the point that you want to be in an organization that doesn't squander enthusiasm. When employees come in with enthusiasm, that finds a place for it, harnesses it, finds a way for that to be productive for the organization, because that's one of the things, it brings joy. It also drives loyalty. Another thing that I think about with retention with customers, with subscribers, is, you can tell pretty early on if they're going to cancel. A lot of companies will wait until the last few days before renewal, before they start reaching out to say, hey, renewal's coming up. We hope you're going to renew. Here's a special offer, whatever. But really, if you look carefully, you can tell in the first days, usually after somebody signs up for a subscription, with a pretty high level of accuracy, if they're going to cancel.
And what are the signs? Is it if they're using it?
Yeah. If they're using it, how they're using it. So there's a couple of things that you can see. One of them is failure to launch. And you would not believe how many people subscribe to all kinds of things and then never actually set up the system, get the first piece of value, complete.
Yeah, I've done that.
You've done that. We've all done it, right? You sign up for something and you say, I'll do it later. If you don't do it right now, it's not going to happen. And that's the place for the company to intervene, right? Really aggressively. So, emails and texts, but also a phone call. Hey, we see that you're paying $100 a month for whatever. We see that you're paying for, you haven't done it. You haven't watched a basketball game. You haven't, you know, used the spreadsheets that you're entitled to use or the templates you're entitled to use. Can we help you? It's very different than when you buy a car, right? If you buy a Lamborghini and you roll it off the showroom floor and you never take it out of first gear, and then you say, this is a terrible car and it doesn't go fast. Right? The dealer is going to be like, "Oh,
Yeah.
you're not a very good driver, but that's not my problem." If you're subscribing to that same car, right, you would return it. You'd say, "This actually isn't a fast car," and so it becomes their obligation to make sure you know how to get the value out of it. And if all you're using it for is to, you know, drive down the streets on, you know, residential roads and, you know, never take it out of second gear or first gear, you're not going to get the full pleasure out of it and you're not going to use it. And so organizations need to understand, first of all, what do successful subscribers look like? What does their behavior look like? And then they need to quickly recognize where people are likely to fall off the good path. And the first place, as I said, is you never got on the good path in the first place. Failure to launch, which is the number one reason that people cancel, is they never got any value in the first place. And it doesn't matter if it's like in the Lamborghini case, your fault or the organization's fault. Like, there could be no real value for you, or it could be that you never found your way to the value. It doesn't matter. So that's the first thing. And then you sometimes see people binge and leave, which is sort of the opposite, which is, I have a very, very acute need right now. So I'm going to join. I'm going to use it really heavily in a really unusual way, in a non-sustainable way. And then I'm done. I'm going to cancel as quickly as I can. And then the third thing is, when you see somebody whose behavior is going for a while and then it sort of starts to drop off, I think of this as sort of the gym arc, right?
Mhm.
You join, you use it a little less, little less, little less. Then you're not using it at all, but you don't cancel because there's hope that you're going to come back in your own mind. So those are some of the patterns that are really easily seen in behavioral data. And I imagine that there are sort of similar things. I don't know exactly what they would be, but with employees where you could tell this employee's kind of checked out.
Absolutely. And much like organizations often wait until it's too late to reach out to customers, the same thing happens on the employment front. But let me ask you this. Do you think the reason organizations don't reach out to a new customer who is not showing that they're getting value, or someone who's falling off, do you think the lack of reach out is because the organization is afraid to bring it up? Like, if I tell them that I know they're unhappy, they're going to cancel right then. When if I just let it simmer, maybe they'll stay on. Is that what you see play out?
Sometimes. So there's a few reasons that companies don't do this. One of them is definitely that, the kind of let sleeping dogs lie. You know, the zombie revenue, I think, is what Netflix calls it. They're really against this. That's why they only have monthly subscriptions. They're like, we don't want zombie revenue. Like, we want revenue from people who are getting value, who are happy with us. So that's one reason, is you're afraid. A second one is they don't really know what to do. They don't recognize it. They don't track it. They don't understand it, and they don't know how to bring somebody back. So step one is knowing what the good path looks like. So in the world of employees, I would imagine that, you know, a good employee, an employee that's going to thrive, might look like, you know, they come in, they engage in projects, they go to lunch with their colleagues, they ask their boss for feedback. Maybe they overstep. Maybe that's, I don't know, is that a good sign or a bad sign? But you know, pushing hard and wanting more might be. I don't know what the right steps are, but the first step is knowing. You know, I have there's a company I'm on the board of, and they actually created something. They call it their GPS. You know, which is the good path system. And they're like, if somebody comes off the good path, it's like they didn't fill out, you know, they didn't complete their onboarding page. They didn't come to the onboarding meeting. They didn't go to the conference. They didn't, you know, all these things. And they intervene really aggressively when they see it.
I think the same can be said for top tier employers. And while the factors are different, the path and the good path and staying on it is much the same. For employees who are really engaged, who are finding fulfillment in their role, we see behaviors like discretionary effort. They're doing things and putting forth energy to something that is not necessarily on their performance review and something their boss didn't say you have to do. It's that choice to do more. We're seeing it in creative thinking. This happens at individual contributor roles, it happens at executive roles. When someone is actively engaged at work, they're coming up with new ideas. They're not always perfect ideas, but they're using this discretionary part of their brain to put forth their best mental effort, that added mental horsepower. And we also see it in the way they interact with their colleagues. Are they, I don't want to say come in because so many organizations are virtual, but do they shut off the meeting instantly? Are they always video off? Do they take a long time to respond to emails? Are they really curt with their colleagues? There are factors that tell us what's going on beneath the surface, and it is a choice of the organization whether they track and monitor and identify all of those factors. But back to leading yourself, it is also on you to recognize in yourself when you are becoming disengaged, when you're becoming dispirited, when you're becoming sometimes resentful, and take proactive action for you. And that's not always to get a new job.
Yeah, that's really important. I think, I talk about this idea of a forever transaction. And people say, do you really mean that every product is forever? Well, obviously not, right? You join a dating service, you sure hope that you're not going to have a forever transaction with them.
Yeah.
But, right, I mean,
that's like Hinge, the app to be deleted.
Right. I love that because that is an organization that understands their good path, right? The good path is you come in, you stay for a few months, and then you find your true love, and then you're out of there. And we let you go, right? We let you go. And I think it's the same with a job, right? I don't think most jobs expect that you're going to stay forever, but as long as you're able to provide them with a path of growth and the things that they value, they're going to stay. So you would hate to think that somebody leaves because they say there's no upward mobility when that's what your organization prides itself on, because it's sort of like the person that didn't take the Lamborghini out of first gear. They never, the value is there and you didn't find your way to it. And I do think about a lot of jobs as a subscription, right? It's an ongoing relationship, right? You get paid every month or every 2 weeks. And the assumption is that you're gonna keep staying, and they're gonna keep providing you with stuff beyond the salary, right? Their growth and feedback and maybe some fun and some meaning. So it is, I've thought about this a lot, and I've thought a lot about how some organizations really invest in their jobs and their careers as if they were products that they're trying to market to the right people.
Mm-hmm.
And other organizations sort of, they don't go beyond, I'm paying you a salary, so do what I ask.
Yeah, some of it to me is you get what you give, right? If I'm paying you a salary, you do what I ask, you will get someone who does what you ask and then eventually decides the salary is not enough. So the level of reciprocity certainly has to be there. But I think back to what's next for employees, because no job really is a forever transaction, maybe unless you go work for the government and decide. But articulating, here's where you could go from here. And if there truly is nowhere to go from there, and none of those routes sound exciting to you, that's okay. Let's just admit it and have a manager who supports that person after 2-3 years of doing this role where there's not a next step. Support them in going elsewhere. Be that cheerleader. Help open a door for them. Write them a great recommendation. There's a huge difference in that, because after 2 or 3 years, that person who wants a growth opportunity and doesn't see one around, and if there's truly not one, they're leaving. Whether you support them and cheer them on and write them a great recommendation, or whether they're probably going to leave, right? The outcome is the same. What you get to decide is, as a leader, am I going to nurture this person's next step, or am I going to expect them to never take it?
Yeah. Yeah. Your point, I love the point about when it's time to leave, let them go. I worked in big firm consulting for my first job, and they actually have Bain, Booz Allen, BCG, McKinsey, they all have really big alumni associations and really big Like when you leave, they help you land, right? I mean, unless,
LinkedIn is that way.
pardon?
LinkedIn is that way. The founder of LinkedIn talks famously about he wants employees to have a next play in mind, even if it's not at LinkedIn. And if it's not at LinkedIn, how can we support you in getting there? And
Yeah.
I think the long play in terms of the ability to attract talent referrals, which we know have the highest level of success, the ability to be that destination employer from an employer branding front, it really is a smart play because, again, this person's leaving or not. You just get to decide how you look in the process.
Right. 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 I love that. Do you know, I mean, just a side note. So we both love LinkedIn and, I've done a lot of work with them. Um, uh, Alan Blue, who's a co-founder of LinkedIn, wrote the foreword for my first book. And one of the things that we talked about when we were working on that is that before LinkedIn, the LinkedIn founders started LinkedIn, they started a dating site. And what they realized, they had a forever transaction mindset, like you just said. Like they had this idea that people come, you should provide them with value until it's time for them to go. You should let them go fairly. You should, the moment of transactions, the starting line, not the finish line, both for your employees and your customers. But then they invested in a business where if you do a great job, they're out of there in 6 months and they never come back. And so when they started their next company, they said, we need a forever promise that lasts longer than 6 months. And so they went with career. And so they really walked the talk.
Yeah, wise play. And I think recognizing that there's nothing wrong with a 6-month transaction. The world still needs dating apps. There's nothing wrong with staying in your first job for a year or two and then going somewhere else. That is okay. Let's just be transparent about it and make the time that you do spend at the dating app or inside of this organization as beneficial as possible. So that spreads to people who may need it in their lives. And then when it is time to depart, we do so fairly instead of, kicking you out the door either way.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad we were able in our 30, a little more than 30 minutes to get from onboarding all the way through what happens when somebody leaves, both an employee and a customer. We kind of covered the full range, and there's so much similarity in the way that you can think about, being a customer, being an employee, or managing an employee, or trying to retain a customer. Such a fun conversation.
There really are so many parallels, and I'm really glad we got to dive in. I think there's certainly a whole host of differences, and people, have different factors when they're making decisions as an employee than they do a customer. But at the end of the day, human beings are in search of value for themselves. They're in search of opportunities. They are in search of fulfillment in all of the decisions that they make. And when organizations put that at the core of their customer experience and their employee experience, we see retention on both sides voluntarily improve.
If people want to find you, either employees looking for inspiration to lead themselves, or organizations that want to be more employee centric and employee supportive, where can they go to find you?
So you can follow me on LinkedIn, and like Robbie, I have several LinkedIn learning courses covering what we've scratched the surface on here today. My new book, Leading Yourself, is everywhere books are sold. It really is a playbook if you want meaning, joy, and opportunities in the job you already have, even if everything's not perfect, that can help you find it.
Thanks so much, Elizabeth. This was a
Thanks
lot
for
of fun.
having me, Robbie. It was.